Do you ever catastrophize situations in your head? Like you always think the worst of whatever is going to happen in a situation. And you do this to prepare yourself because maybe of past traumas. Or are you more of a realist or more of an optimist in your thinking? That's what we're going to talk about today on Boldly Driven Conversations with Bree. So let's go. Let's get started. So catastrophizing, what is it? I think the first thing that we need to know is what it is. And catastrophizing really is a cognitive distortion where we believe something is far worse than what it's actually going to be or actually is. This oftentimes involves fixating on only one possible outcome and then treating it as if that is what is actually going to happen, even when it's not. Like, even when we know logically that's not the thing that's going to happen. But for some reason, we treat it like it is. That's what catastrophizing is. And I am an expert at it because I've been doing it for pretty much my entire adult life. Not so much when I was a kid, but once I became a young adult, had a lot of things happen that were bad, worst case scenarios, and they actually happened. And so I've carried that with me, and it's something that I am desperately trying to heal myself from, and just really, by heal I mean change my way of thinking, so that I'm not catastrophizing like every single thing in my life. It is a cognitive distortion, and it's a thought pattern. So it is something that we can change. We can change cognitive distortions. But the problem with it, and why we want to change it, is that it can significantly impact our emotional well-being. I know it has for me. Some of the key aspects of catastrophizing is exaggeration. So this is like overstating the severity of the consequences of a situation. If I don't, do the best at my job, then I'm going to get fired, and then I'm going to be homeless because I don't have a job, and I'm never going to find a job again, and it's going to be a blight on my resume. And, we go down this horrible exaggeration, this trail of what could or will happen in our minds. And then it also means that we tend to fixate. Like I said, we tend to fixate and focus solely on the worst case scenario, and we ignore other possibilities. And when we do this, this is what tends to get us really stressed in a situation. I have a friend of mine who has some big things coming up, and they are hard things. And sometimes I can tell they are completely fixated on the worst case scenario. And the reasoning is I can identify it, is that the worst case scenarios have happened almost every time in dealing with the situation. And so I get it. But when we fixate on what that worst case scenario is, it does stuff in our bodies. Like, we get certain sensations, stress sensations, and we can't stop thinking about it because we're fixating on that is what is going to happen. And then there's also this belief in inevitability, where we just assume that the worst outcome is inevitable and that we can't actually change it. That no matter what we do or no matter what the situation is, we're going to get screwed, or we don't really have a choice, is the way our minds kind of think about these things. So those are like the key aspects of it. And so now let's talk about some of the examples. Like, let's use some examples, and maybe you can identify with some of these examples. So there is like relationship catastrophizing, and this is where, like, if you have like a minor disagreement with someone, you have this thought of, this small argument means that our relationship is doomed and that we're going to break up, kind of thing. That's catastrophizing because it was just a small argument. Or catastrophizing a partner's behavior is like, they haven't texted me back in an hour, so they have to be cheating on me, or they haven't replied to my message for, this amount of time. Or, they haven't called me, or, those kinds of things. So we automatically think the worst case scenario, oh, they're cheating on me. Oh, they don't love me anymore. They don't want to be with me anymore. So that's catastrophizing. Or like, in my case, what I had a lot during my adulthood, my husband, if he didn't call me or didn't get home at a certain time, he was in a car accident coming home from work and was dead. And now I was stuck with these kids by myself, kind of thing. Like, it became like an actual issue, especially like when it was icy on the roads. We lived in Ohio and stuff. So it was like catastrophizing every single thing. And then there's like career catastrophizing. And that's where, like, if you get rejected for a job that you applied for, you think, I'm never going to find a job. I'm a failure. I'm no good. Nobody will ever want to hire me, kind of thing. Or if you make a minor mistake in your job, kind of like I mentioned before, it's like, I made a small error and now my boss is going to fire me for sure, kind of thing. Like, we automatically go to the worst case scenario. And then there's health catastrophizing. This I see quite a bit with a lot of people, where it's like, where they have a minor symptom of something and it's like, oh, I have a headache, so I think it's a brain tumor. Like, no, it's a headache, maybe you were stressed, or maybe you didn't drink enough water, maybe have you ate today? Like, there are certain things that in our health where we can just like catastrophize the fact that, we're not feeling our best. So now we have a brain tumor. We don't realize we even do it sometimes, that our brains just automatically kind of go there. Or like aging and normal aging, like I'm getting older, and so I'm gonna get sick and I'm gonna die soon, or I'm unattractive and nobody's ever going to want to be with me because I'm in my 40s, and who wants to be with a woman in their 40s when they can be with a woman in their 20s? Like, we catastrophize our minds, our health and our well-being and what we have to give to the world, and then I think the next major category that this happens a lot, as an example, is social catastrophizing. So you have that awkward moment and everyone noticed my mistake, I'm so embarrassed, and they all think I'm an idiot, kind of thing. I know I have felt that way so many times. That's an area where I tend to catastrophize quite a bit. And then there's rejection in general, like they didn't invite me to this social gathering, so I'm not good enough for anyone, or they're not my friend anymore, or they didn't really like me in the first place, kind of thing. I have no friends, kind of thing. And it's like we catastrophize these things, these ideas in our heads, and then we become fixated on them, and then we believe them, and we create our own limiting beliefs through these things. So what are the causes? Like, why do we catastrophize? Like, why do we do this? And I think there are four main reasons why we do this. The first reason is there's the fear of the unknown, fear of uncertainty. Uncertainty itself is such a trigger for so many people. I know it is for me, where we tend to catastrophize as a way to try to control the situation. We want to control it. And so it's like, if we can think it out, if we can think out the worst case scenario, then somehow we can control it, and we can make it so that that worst case scenario doesn't actually happen. And that's just not true. But that's the reason why we do it, is because we think, oh, I can control it if I know what's coming. So the fear of the unknown. And then there's past experiences. And again, I totally identify with this because my past experiences have been kind of really negative in certain areas of my life. And this will lead to a heightened sense of fear and anxiety. And it makes it so much easier to catastrophize certain situations. Going back to like some of the relationship stuff, if you've ever been cheated on, if a partner doesn't text you back right away, and that's what your partner before did, and they actually cheated on you, then that can be super triggering. And yeah, you're going to catastrophize because you think you see a pattern of behavior. And this happens to me a lot, where like I'll see like a pattern of behavior in people, and I'll automatically like catastrophize the situation because I'll be like, oh, well, that's what that person did before, and so automatically I'm going to think that's what's going to happen again. So I become my own worst enemy in that. Perfectionism. Again, totally can identify with this. When we strive for perfectionism, this can lead to the fear of failure. And this fuels catastrophizing thoughts. Because if we don't do it perfect, then we're not good enough. If we don't do it perfect, then all the worst case scenarios are going to happen. Perfectionism is the death of so many forward progress, because we tend to catastrophize and we don't think of things in reality. We think of things worst case scenarios, especially when we're trying to attain perfection, because perfection is a lie anyway. Nobody can actually attain perfection. You're not going to. So we just need to get out of our heads. And it has taken me so long, and I still sometimes fall back into that myself. It can be very triggering. And then the fourth thing is low self-esteem. So when we have a negative self-image, this will absolutely contribute to catastrophizing, because we believe that we are incapable of handling the challenges. We're incapable of handling the thing that is in front of us, this thing, even if it's so minor. Like we catastrophize it because we think we're not good enough. We think that we can't handle it. And then the consequences of all of these things is we get the increased stress and anxiety. Like we become our own worst enemy. We are constantly worrying. And then the fear, it snowballs and it becomes chronic stress. And then we find ourselves moving towards burnout. We find ourselves not resting. We find ourselves thinking negatively instead of positively and optimistically, or even just realistically about challenges that we face in our life. And another consequence is it hurts our relationships. Our relationships will become very strained because we're constantly thinking negative, and we're having negative communication with our partner. So, talking about the example of when someone doesn't text us back and we think that they're cheating. Well, we might accuse them of that. We might just outright accuse them of that because, we get ourselves all hyped up, and then we're like, you're cheating on me because you didn't text me back, or because you're working with so-and-so, or because of this, that, or the other thing. Like we catastrophize things, and this causes us to have a negative thought cycle, and that thought cycle is going to manifest itself in the way that we communicate with others around us. The third thing I think that a major consequence is that we procrastinate. So if we feel like a situation is going to be negative, then we think about we're the worst case scenario, we're catastrophizing the situation, we will procrastinate. One, for the fear of failure, because we don't want to fail in this certain area. We don't want to fail in this scenario, but also because we just want to avoid the pain of the situation, because we've put in our minds that this is going to be a painful situation. And so we just avoid it. We don't want to tackle it. We don't think we're good enough. So we don't want to deal with it because it's going to be imperfect. We don't want the pain of things. So we avoid it. We just avoid dealing with the situation. And because we're in our minds, we're thinking it's going to be way worse than what it probably is going to be. And all of this, one of the consequences in all of this is that we end up having physical health issues. Because the chronic stress of catastrophizing everything will absolutely contribute to different physical ailments that we'll have. It might start with just a headache, but then we lead into burnout. And that's literally what happened to me a few years ago when I went through burnout. A couple years ago, I just was in worst case scenario with literally everything when it had to do like finances and relationship and all of that. Like, I just was constantly in worst case scenario mode. And this caused severe adrenal fatigue because of the high cortisol levels, and then they would dump out. It was the environment I was in, but it also was me. It was me taking all of those challenges that were going on and catastrophizing them in my mind because I needed and wanted control. And so there was this release when I finally have started to not catastrophize things all the time. And I'm still terrible at it. I tend to do this quite a bit, but I'm getting better at it. And I can feel the release of stress and the freedom that I'm experiencing now by not catastrophizing everything all the time and realizing the amount of negativity that was really bringing in my life. So, overall, it reduces our quality of life when we catastrophize things. And so it becomes very difficult for us to enjoy the present moment as well. We just constantly are thinking futurely in a negative way. And so then we don't experience the good and the amazing things that are happening right in our present moments because we're constantly thinking about worst case scenarios. So how then do we cultivate more optimism in our life instead of catastrophizing everything? I think we have to understand first that optimism is that positive outlook. It can significantly improve our life if we are thinking more positively, not toxic positivity, because we don't want to fall into that. And I'll kind of talk about that, I think, a little bit later. But really, optimism in general is the general expectation of positive outcomes. We look at the world through hopefulness, and we think the best about every situation and person. This is healthy optimism. And it's a generalness of just optimism, of thinking the best about a situation and not catastrophizing automatically. And then there's realistic too. I do want to bring in the whole idea of being realistic. Sometimes there are situations where there's going to be negativity. We don't want to be toxic positive, like, everything's going to be great, because that's not helpful either. That realistic is that balance, between, and that's where we're like looking objectively at the situation and considering all possible outcomes, both the positive things and acknowledging that there will probably be some bad or negative things that we're going to have to deal with, and it's not dwelling on either of those things. It's not dwelling on the negative or being so hyper focused on the positive that we're not able to be real about real life situations that we're facing that could and will have negative consequences in our life. But we want to be more optimistic in our life, right? If we're constantly in this catastrophizing mode, we want to be more optimistic. So how do we do that? The first thing is we have to challenge those negative thoughts. We've talked about this. We have to then reframe those negative thoughts into positive thoughts. We have to replace the negative thought with something positive. And I've talked a lot about it, but gratitude really is the foundation of so many things. And gratitude journaling is such a wonderful practice to help us, to find the positive and to be more optimistic in general. So there's some cognitive things we can do, but then there are also behavioral things that we can do, such as we can set realistic goals for ourselves instead of trying to strive for perfection all the time and always, trying to be the best at everything and not have failure. We can just set realistic goals for ourselves. And we have to practice self-care. We have to practice what we preach to other people about taking care of themselves. We have to take care of ourselves too, so that we are able to, deal with the negative things in our life. And then we have to also surround ourselves with positive people. I think that makes such a huge difference in our lives when we are surrounding ourselves with positive people. I've said it before. My dad used to always say, you lie with dogs, you wake with fleas. And it used to drive me crazy, but it is really so true. And then I think we also have to talk to other people. we have to talk to other people and share our feelings about what we're feeling. And then there's always professional help. Like if we find ourselves in this cognitive place where we just cannot deal, you know, we're not going to be in a good place. We're not going to be a positive person or a realistic person. We're just going to be that negative person. So getting professional help is a really good thing. You know, talking to a counselor and a therapist. I talked a lot. My therapist would call me out all the time when she saw me catastrophizing, like this liminal space I'm in right now with all these transitions. She would catch me and she would call me on it. And it was such a good thing because it was like, okay, yeah, let's reframe this. Help me reframe this so that we're not into worst case scenario mode. You know, so being realistic is assessing those situations in our life and considering, you know, all the possible outcomes of things, both positive and negative, like I said. And so some of the things that help us become more realistic is having objectivity. So assessing the situation without bias or emotion. That is something that helps us be more realistic rather than just always trying to be super positive or being super negative. And finding balance, like considering both the positive and the negative. Like we have to consider both of those things. That we have to create that balance. And being flexible too, having flexibility and being open to changing our minds about things. You know, maybe something is starting out really negative, but it could turn out really positive if we are open and flexible in our minds. And then too, I think the biggest thing is acceptance. We have to acknowledge the reality of a situation. Even if it's not what we hope for, you know, like so often we can like be overly optimistic or we can be overly negative. And sometimes we just have to accept it is what it is, you know? Being realistic means when we have a job search that we know we're not going to get the first job maybe that we applied for. It's going to take some time. And with relationships, we have to acknowledge that relationships take a lot of work, you know, and when we talk about health concerns, we were talking before about catastrophizing with like health. We have to understand that there are potential risks to situations and to things that we do, and that we have to make informed decisions for for our health, you know? And we have to be realistic about our aging too. Like we are all going to age. And really aging is such a privilege. Like I think I've talked about that before and maybe I'll talk about it again. It really is such a privilege, especially if you've known people who have died very young. It is such a privilege to age. It truly, truly is. But we have to be realistic about it. We're not going to look and be able to do the same things we were when we were 20 when we are in our 40s. You know, being realistic really helps us make more informed decisions, and it really helps us manage stress more effectively. And it really helps our overall well-being, you know, so that we're not constantly in the negative or in the toxic positivity. Okay, so what can we do to limit us from catastrophizing? Is there anything we can do? I think that there are 3 more things that we can do to help us to not always catastrophize. And the first thing is we have to limit our media, social media, and just media in general. If you watch the news, you're going to be constantly seeing negative things, and you're constantly going to be in that negative mode and thinking the worst possible things because the news sells negativity. Like, people want to read that apparently. But when we get into it too much, we constantly put ourselves in that negative catastrophizing mode. And we just have to be more mindful. Being mindful and being more present in the present moment really helps us to not dwell on the past or the future. You know, just staying in that present moment allows us to enjoy the moment so that we're not thinking about the present or future. You know, we're in this present moment right now. And then we have to celebrate small victories. We talked about this a lot. You know, celebrating the small things that happen in your life really helps us to be able to not think so big picture all the time. It allows us to stay present in the moment. So sorry, I'm so thirsty this morning. I don't know why. So, you know, cultivating optimism and cultivating being more realistic and moving out of catastrophizing all the time really is such a journey. So I have some questions for you that we can ask ourselves when we are catastrophizing. Like maybe we find ourselves we're catastrophizing, you know, we catch ourselves. Here are some really good questions that we can ask ourselves to help. These questions have really helped me. And the first one is this a worst case scenario? You know, are there other possibilities or outcomes that would be less severe than what I'm thinking? The second question would be, have I experienced this before? And this, you know, can be a double-edged sword, especially if you've had a lot of negative experiences. But I think something that helps us is we can ask ourselves a follow-up question is, how did I cope with this in the past? You know, and can I apply those coping strategies from before to now to make this better, or to be able to understand I have the resilience to get through this negative situation? The third question is am I assuming the worst case scenario without any true evidence? You know, are there facts or data or things that I'm totally missing that are supporting my negative beliefs about myself and this whole situation? The fourth question is am I focusing on the negative while ignoring positive aspects about a situation, and the situation that I'm in? You know, am I just dwelling on the negative, or if I'm being toxic positive, am I just dwelling on the positive and not being realistic? So that's a really good question to ask ourselves. And I think we're in the fifth question. Fifth question is this making me feel better about myself in the situation? Or is this making me feel worse when I'm thinking about this worst case scenario and thinking about how this is all going to come out? Is this constructive or is this destructive for me as an individual? And the sixth question is, what would I say to a friend if they were having these same thoughts about the situation or this person or whatever it is that we're talking about? Would I offer them the same level of negativity that I'm offering myself? Or would I help them see like the positive side of things or a more realistic side of things instead of dwelling on this negative outcome that we are just so sure is going to be happening? And then the seventh question I think that is super helpful is, what really is the chances of this happening? Is this really going to happen, or am I just making this up in my head? Is it really realistic that this is going to happen, or like literally am I just really making this worst case scenario, And then the converse side of this for like, am I being too toxic, like toxic positivity, is, am I maintaining a positive outlook on this while also acknowledging the challenges that I face? Or am I only looking at, it's going to be great, am I only looking at positive scenarios in this? Because that's toxic. That's not realistic. That's not, living in optimism. That's living in toxic positivity, because we're not being real about true life situations. There are going to be setbacks in negative situations, and we have to be real about those things. And am I able to find a balance between the realism and negativity and hope? Am I able to find a balance between hope and realism? Am I able to understand that there are real implications to the situation that I'm in? And is my optimism motivating me and motivating others, or is it discouraging me and discouraging others? I think that if it's discouraging people, then that's toxic positivity. That's not true optimism or, living in realism of, there's one thing to have faith, and there's another thing to have faith that is discouraging to other people. That's not true faith. True faith is going to bring true hope and true positivity to people and not make people feel terrible about themselves. And then I think specific to toxic positivity, there are a couple questions that we can ask ourselves, such as, am I dismissing or downplaying negative emotions? Am I just ignoring negative emotions in general of others and myself about the situation? And am I ignoring difficult situations and conversations because I want to be positive? Am I ignoring and procrastinating conversations I need to have with other people because I'm being that toxic positive person when in a negative situation? And the last one is, am I putting pressure on myself to be positive all the time? Am I not being real about real life situations? Am I just completely focusing on being positive all the time? Okay, so your challenge today, I went way over on my time. I'm so sorry, but I really felt like this was something that so many people are dealing with, especially during this time period of life with the election coming up. There are a lot of worst case scenarios that people are discussing, and we need to be real about things that are going on in our lives and the world around us. So your bold challenge today is to ask yourself some of these questions. If you find yourself catastrophizing, use some of these questions to get yourself out of that mode. And if you are at the opposite end of the spectrum and you're like Miss Toxic Positivity all the time, ask yourself some of those 6 questions, about toxic positivity. Am I being too positive? Am I being too hopeful? Is there anything as too hopefulness? Because that's not really hope. Hope is knowing that something is good is going to happen, right? It's the expectation of good. But I think that sometimes we take it too far because we don't want to deal with the negative. And that's when we get into toxic positivity. So, all right, guys, have a fantastic